Hello, and welcome to Supply Chain Next. I'm your host, Richard Donaldson. Join me as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges practitioners face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network.
Well, I'm jumping right in, throwing the record on just to get us, because all this stuff is gold. But definitely want to just welcome everybody again to this. We'll call it episode or panel or whatever this is, because this is more than just a podcast. But this is, 3 or 4 of us that have known each other in the supply chain industry for a while. I'd go through all the introductions of Brian and Deborah and Daniel, but everyone can see that and read it. Let's just jump right in. The point of today is to really talk about the idea of finding a day out there, or an international supply chain day, and does the industry need that? Can we use it, and then how could we use it? And I think everyone here brings a different perspective to the discussion, but has a breadth that goes across the world, across the supply chains. And I think the early kind of intimations were in, and like, oh, this sounds like a great idea. So now the question becomes, how do we do it? And I couldn't think of 3 other people that I know can get this crap done, other than you all. So I dragged you in here to say, all right, help me get this done.
So before any of us get to work on this, Richard, you owe us something.
Okay, by all means.
Why do you think this is a good idea? What would the goal be? What would we be trying to accomplish?
Oh, Daniel, you be careful what you wish for sometimes. So I have a thought about that, right? So I think for me, when I looked around and said, there's all this supply chain momentum. We've moved into the decade of supply chain. Supply chain was top of mind prior to the pandemic, has now become even uber top of mind coming out of the pandemic. And everyone's talking about supply chain innovation and digitization and this, that, and the other thing, and circularity and sustainability. Yet I have yet to see kind of how that's grounded into something that becomes tangible. And so for me, I thought, well, geez, what if there was a day where the world supply chain, because it is the world supply chain. I keep sharing that National Geographic article that's out there. I think I've shared it with all you guys, that I think has one of the best infographics that basically says of the 7.6 billion people on this planet, everyone is a part of the supply chain, whether they're a consumer or a producer. It's not just supply chain in the abstract, like, ooh, that sounds like this enterprise thing. It's like, no, you're a part of it, whether you knew it or not. And so social responsibility can extend into the world of supply chain. So how best to educate people than through kind of a day that allows people to hear about what's going on, but more importantly, sets objectives for it, right? So in a succinct way, I think there needs to be a day that is recognized where we can begin to measure on an annual basis our progress as a world in bringing the supply chain into a more sustainable format, a more circularity leading to sustainability. And I know this is big for Deborah, in that whole area, or for all of us. But for me, it's not just about just doing it because it's good, but it actually makes fiscal, economic sense, right? It's not about, oh, this is a nice feeling. It's actually what's going to do good for the enterprises themselves, would benefit their margins, but ultimately that in turn then benefits the whole world, because if we tune our supply chain, let's just say we make it 60% circular, the impact on greenhouse gases and everything else that we're trying to tackle, that's the root of it. If our supply chain is that circularity, then all of a sudden all those other things start to come in line. So you asked, Daniel, there's my answer.
Look what you've started.
I actually take complete umbrage, and I'm outraged that you would suggest that it's only a decade of supply chain.
Well, thank you.
I argue that we are entering a golden age of supply chain. And I actually think the next century supply chain is going to be the beginning and the end. That's where all the action is going to be. And the way I encapsulate it, and I think we trademarked this, but what we don't realize is that, and this, Richard, we've coined the phrase, the world is a supply chain. Right, because the world really is a supply chain, and whether you think of natural supply chains or man-made ones, right? The entire world is a supply chain, and the way we talk about, the idea that you just explained is that, our past as a world was built on supply chains, right? The past ran on supply chains. The present is run on supply chains. Our future is going to run on supply chains. The world is a supply chain, is how we encapsulate all of that. In a booklet that my co-founder and I wrote in 2019 and then published in March of 2020, it was just to explain, the way that we're thinking about this and why we're building the fund that we're building. And I didn't know this before we started working on the booklet. It turns out that between 1975 and 2050, there are going to be more people living in the world than existed throughout human history before 1975. Mm-hmm. And so then you start to think about the pressures that this puts on the limited resources of the world. And then you start to understand that, supply chains and how we manage them, how we deploy them, how we create them, whether they're sustainable or not, whether they're circular or not, those are really where the big problems the world has to deal with are going to be. So, like I said, I'm highly offended that you would minimize supply chains
to just a decade.
To a decade. How dare you?
Well, this is a part of the conversation, Brian. Now you've opened up. This is a century of supply chain, or maybe supply chain is everything now. Supply chain is life. How's that? It's no longer oxygen.
That's more like it.
So before I jump in, I'm really curious to hear what part of that completely offended Deborah.
I'm going to play off of what Brian said, because where he's saying the world is a supply chain, we have a saying, the Circular Supply Chain Network, that's everything is inventory. Mostly because I love inventory so much, but it is. And as we start thinking about everything you see around you, wherever you are right now, becomes feedstock for something else in the future. Ideally, it remains as itself for as long as it can, unless we can add more economic value somehow with it. And so we start to see the world much larger as supply chain professionals, where traditionally, let's say up until now, we have sprinted down the runway towards point of sale. And then we could wash our hands of everything. That was our success mark. Tomorrow, point of sale will be the beginning of a relationship ongoing with whatever customer that we have, and we'll be repairing much more than we'll be building new. And so this idea of everything is inventory was there because we created the network for supply chain nerds to get together and just nerd out on circularity and its impact on supply chain. And so we've got one sweatshirt that says supply chains will save the world, one sweatshirt that says smaller circles, meaning in the butterfly diagram. And so I, would love to hear thoughts, and I'll punt it to you, Daniel, specifically, because we could do a supply chain day to relish in our nerdiness and make it so wonderful that only supply chain professionals, and I say with air quotes, because by some measure, it's 37% of America's workforce works in the supply chain. It's a very large, generous definition, but I'll take it. There's one version. The other version is as an advocating type of bridge building to the rest of the world who hasn't heard of supply chain and thinks maybe it's super boring, or that's just, you take it to UPS, and they don't totally grab it. And this is where I want to hand it over to Mr. Supply Chain, who has written the book on supply chain for dummies. Drum roll, please, Daniel Stanton.
And I did notice it's the top of Brian's pile, so I'll take that.
I think it must be this one.
Yeah, I was going to say, you guys are slipping, Richard and Deborah. So, Brian, I am so offended that you would limit supply chain to just a century, right? And of course, the other problem we have is we talk about supply chains, which implies that it's linear. Yeah. And in fact, it's not a chain, it's a network. And it's not just about supply, it's about demand. Yeah. And what we're really trying to move towards is circularity. And so you quickly just why on earth did we call that a supply chain? Yeah. Right? But we did, and it stuck, and we all work with it. And I think that's just a great a great example of the problem that we have. And Richard, I think that's at the heart of what you're trying to do with this idea of a supply chain day, is to raise awareness, right? Because it happens to be maybe 37% of the US population works in this field, and we've chosen a really terrible name, and we don't do a good job of explaining it, but we need people to understand it, because all of us are a part of supply chains. All of us depend on supply chains. All of us contribute to them. And I would argue, it's really, it's a way of looking at the world and our relationship to the world, and the relationship between our companies, our organizations in the world. And when you adopt that perspective, when you adopt that view, you're able to make different decisions. You're able to value your priorities differently, measure things differently. And until you make that pivot, until you see the world that way, you can't, right? That we're going to continue making very short-term, suboptimal, siloed decisions and miss out on the value and the opportunity that we need, right? Because we do have pressing challenges as companies and frankly, not just as a civilization, but as a species, right? To make sure that we can continue inhabiting our current environment. And the answers to all of that come from supply chains. Richard, I would argue that the goal, we need to start with a goal, right? The end in mind. And I think, the goal for doing an international supply chain day or week or month or decade or century, right? It is to raise awareness of the concept of supply chains, help people understand what they are, why they're important, what their role is, and in particular, to make sure that we're reaching young people before they choose a career, as they're preparing for a career early in their careers, so that they get that set of goggles. They have that lens to look through for all of their studies, for all of their career choices, in particular in Brian's world. If they're innovators and they're thinking about startups, right? What are the problems that we could solve, and how do I think about those in the context of supply chains? And in Deborah's world, looking for stupid waste that surrounds us all the time, right? And making choices and influencing decisions that move us towards more circular supply chains.
Okay. It's sort of like that last little thought, like, I thought there was like a big word about to come out. Like there was like something I was just waiting, like, and supply chain.
Can I file a special dispensation for a later discussion?
Yes.
Related though.
Yes.
I'm often really jealous of engineers because they have a field called engineering, and then they have a noun. They can call themselves engineers.
Yep.
And we have a field called supply chain, and we call ourselves supply chain professionals.
Right. It doesn't roll off the tongue. There's no question about that.
If this is our shot to change our noun, I am so in, but I just am going to file that. So please, Richard, at a later date, special dispensation.
I don't know if this, I don't think this qualifies, but the members, I've taken to calling the members of the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation suppliomaniacs. I think it needs a bit of branding help.
HR is going to raise a flag on that.
Right. There might be future issues.
I think Daniel's immediate reaction, I think Mr. Supply Chain's immediate reaction probably suggests that's not quite the answer that I thought it was.
But it's a start in the right direction. But in that, so I think there's so kind of come back, and I think in a sense that, number one, awareness, right? We've all been talking about that. And I think everyone's, clued up on that, right? That right now we're also still at the very, I'll call it step zero, where it's just we're raising awareness. But then from there, that awareness, which I think, Daniel, you're also kind of touching on directly and indirectly is transparency, right? There's something, in all the conversations I've had in the last couple of years, transparency seems to be the number one thing that I hear from supply chain executives, supply chain practitioners, because that transparency then brings that ability to see into the supply chain, recognize what's going on there. But what I'm opening to is like, what does that mean for everybody else? What does transparency mean?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to catch you on that. And, this is the academic in me, but when you say transparency, what do you mean? And I'll just jump to the chase, because for me, there's a difference between visibility and transparency.
Fair point.
Visibility is being able to see your own supply chain,
Fair
right?
Point.
And that's, folks are talking about that a lot right now because of 2020, 2021, right?
Yep.
Transparency is letting other people see what's happening in your supply chain. Right. And that is a much different group of people that are having that conversation.
Right.
For different reasons.
So I'll give you the hybrid.
I don't think it's that different
it's going to come. I'm going to come right in that one, because I'm going to, I'll let you jump on it, because I'm going to thread the needle here. So when I look at visibility, and I think you're correct, right? So as a corporation, I want visibility into my supply chain, but it's a competitive, advantage to sort of maintain some privacy around that. Totally understand that. But then you look at that National Geographic infographic that shows that's transparency around the 107 gigatons of stuff that is consumed on an annual basis, where it comes from, which types of minerals and mines it's coming out of, what does it get pumped into? That transparency, I think when people see that, because every time I show that graphic, people are just, oh my God. Number one, I didn't realize that there's that few items that make up the base of the supply chain, right? Most people I was unaware that, it's like, a few dozen elements or minerals that are being mined on an annual basis make up pretty much everything that we produce, right? That type of transparency is like, that's the illuminating awakening moment where you're just kind of like, oh my God, there's so much we can do here. Or you see the 94 gigatons coming out of the earth, the 7 gigatons in circularity. So you can make the comment, the world supply chain today is 7% circular. Again, through that transparency as a globe, we can all say, well, shit, why can't that be 50%? And how do we measure against that? Because I think you contribute that data as a corporation anonymously to create global transparency around the supply chain without losing the competitive advantage of your own supply chain's visibility.
But that's the key, is what's the incentive for a company to voluntarily give up data that could erode their competitive advantage?
Right.
But
Fair
here's
point.
The deal. It doesn't have to be human transparent. It needs to be transparent. And I think we have a chance to be responsible with the way that we share data. I don't think anyone would say, oh gosh, we all have to give away our IP and trade secrets. Right. But the generation of spenders quickly coming into the economy have different expectations for decision making. And I think we go for transparency, or we go for visibility in order to support the decisions that we want to make and the problems we're trying to solve. And so as more consumers come into the market who actually care where the beef was raised, or they don't want to eat beef at all and they want to go to something else, but oh gosh, this soy product has really gone through the ringer. Wow, 10,000 miles for this 1 cup of soy milk. That seems excessive. And we're going to start having the ability to know. And I think we're going to end up with the haves and the have-nots. And the haves are going to say, yes, have at it. Check out my supply chain. There are areas I need to improve. I'm going to hold a community hackathon. Come and help me solve this problem. And then there's going to be the other folks that are the target of investigative reporting for all of the areas that they're trying to hide. Mm-hmm. And I think this sits with the supply chain. And so all this to say, we have a lot of problems to solve. And how do we make circulating materials and resources? How do we accompany each and every item with a digital companion that says where it's been and what water was used and what energy source was used, but yet not give up what was put into that product so that companies can still innovate and hold some level of IP protection? But we have the technology to do it today. It just freaks everybody out. So that's the piece Supply chain day, Richard.
Right. There we go. It's back.
It's expensive. And it's expensive. So who's going to pay for it? But
well, it's expensive unless Brian invests in the companies that figure out how to do this stuff, and it gets more, in the public sphere, right? So, I mean, this is where the innovation's coming in, Brian.
RFID was really expensive 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. And the reason I'm so bullish about investing in supply chain technology as a broad opportunity is that with each day that goes by, the technologies that make these sorts of things possible are getting much more advanced, much more sophisticated. Their costs are going down exponentially, so to speak. And so there's no reason why the future that Deborah is describing couldn't be realized. Definitely within our lifetime.
Right.
That's our show, folks. Thanks for coming.
Right. International supply chain. All right, there we go. High five. All right. Well, let me build on that for a little. Oh, okay, go ahead, Brian. Yeah.
That there's one observation I'd like to, maybe actually two, since you were so polite as to let me get away with interjecting. But one is, it strikes me when I think about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. At the end of the day, they all really boil down to rethinking supply chains, right? Whether it's supply chains on land, supply chains in water, air quality, it all boils down to supply chains. And then the other thing, when I'm talking to investors, as you guys probably know, a lot of investors these days are really excited about climate change. And there's a lot of money that's going into climate tech. And I say to them, you realize that climate change is happening because of human activity. And human activity is driven by supply chains. Right. So I don't know if you need to be an Einstein to realize that. It seems pretty straightforward to me, and I'm pretty sure I'm not Einstein. But it seems as if we're going to get our arms around climate change and the climate crisis, we need to take a very long and hard look at supply chains and innovation in supply chains.
It actually feels like cheating to me, Brian, to say that the scope of your fund is you're targeting supply chain innovation. Because, for me, supply chain is planning, sourcing, making, delivering, returning, or enabling something of value. Well, that's like everything.
It
right?
is cheating. It's cheating. It's absolutely cheating. Do I look like someone who's going to let go of an advantage if I can find it? No, it's absolutely cheating.
But it's true though, and I think. But going back to the point though is, and I think climate change is an outcome of mismanaged supply chains.
Yes.
Right. And I think that connection, and yeah, I know Dan kind of seen that, but I think this is where you're looking at some of the symptoms, but people don't get down to the root problems. And really, at the end of the day, it may not be everything, but the supply chain is really that's the activity. We're moving all this stuff around on the planet. Everyone's 7.6 billion people are doing something every day to exchange stuff. Right. And that stuff, as it moves around, gets produced, consumed, otherwise transported, that is contributing to all the other things that we see in there. And it has this cascading effect. You go 50% circular, well, you're going to drop everything else that are sustainability goals instantly as a result of that. Right. But that kind of, again, awareness, that kind of visibility and transparency is not there for the world to see yet. That's also what this day is kind of intended to go do. So I'm going to kind of go into another topic that's very hot for everybody as well, because visibility, transparency is all right there. But what about resiliency? That's another term I keep hearing bandied about. I don't have a great lock on it. Is it as important to the community of international supply chain? I mean, is that something else that we need? Because currently that seems to be a big deal. And I see Dan.
I've spent the day working on an academic paper about resilience, risk management, and trust. So I feel like I'm relatively well equipped.
There we go.
At this moment. And so one of the things I'll say, risk and resilience are very much interrelated. And in general, we look at risk as being uncertainty around the supply chain. and we view resilience as being a capability or a characteristic of the supply chain, right? And so in that sense, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. I'm glad you brought that in, because we jumped right into sustainability as a supply chain topic, because it's something that we've all got strong feelings, I think, in support of. We all seem to be fans of the planet, but the truth is that isn't the definition of supply chain. That is an aspect of supply chain, as are risk and resilience, as is efficiency, as is variety, right? There are all these different things. At the end of the day, supply chains are how we get things of value, how we deliver things of value. And we have to, I think, if we're going to talk about an International Supply Chain Day and raising awareness, one of the dangers is sort of falling into one of those pits too deep. Instead of saying, hey, supply chain is how we address all of these things. And there are people who focus their careers on just one piece. And then, they're supposed to say, but actually they're all interconnected, right? And that's the beauty of looking at it as a supply chain, is you can actually see how those things tie together, right? How can we improve efficiency and reduce environmental impact and, eliminate human rights violations, and all at the same time? The only way you get that done is by having a supply chain view.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah, anything? I see the head nodding.
Yeah, objection.
Was it the planet part? You're not in favor of the planet?
I mean, we like the planet, maybe not the people. How's that? Right? I mean, it's like the planet's good.
Well, some of the people.
People are okay.
Sorry,
be
Deborah.
Easier. The mismanagement of supply chains, we have made choices these last 100 years based on selling trash to consumers. And our biggest decision has been, how many moments until this is considered trash? Is it 5 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it a year? Is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? And this is planned obsolescence, which today's economy is built on. But I don't want to knock it quite so much, because 100 years ago, life was pretty shit. And now it's pretty awesome. We're healthier. We have more rights. We have more equity. We have the ability to work our way up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I would say we're nicer to each other, but it doesn't seem like it because of the internet. However, we have reaped a lot of benefits out of this type of an economic model. So I'm in the camp of, let's not assume nothing is working. There are actually facets. 8.5% per Circle Economy's research, circular today. So it's not like we're totally a lost cause. We know how to do scrap metal. We know how to do post-consumer paper. We know how to do refurbishment. It's just that they're usually the part of the supply chain that's like at the end of the unlit hallway under the stairs. Like the poor things are like never the superheroes. And the biggest switch in the next 10 years is going to be, they're going to become the anchor of everything that we do. And so that's my one objection to the mismanage. I don't know if we've mismanaged so much as we've created a system that was never going to last forever. And there were some decisions made. We need to unmake the decisions now. But I think that we have figured out how to do supply chain extremely well, and that will be a good foundation for us.
So let me double click. I'm not only going to let you off the hook that easy, Deborah, because we have the transparency, visibility, sustainability, circularity is all right there. I mean, those are two big themes, right? But and I'm just throwing resiliency as a concept out, because one of the things about doing these types of days or raising awareness is if you overcomplicate. One thing about the supply chain is people just, they shy away from it. They're like, oh my God, it's too complicated. It's like, well, okay, let's make it simple for you guys. Daniel has obviously made a career out of that. so we have someone on here who does that. I mean, he has made it for dummies, right? So, but I think there's like the concepts around what do we want our global supply chain to really be focused on? Clearly, sustainability, circularity, we kind of started there. Clearly, visibility, transparency is there. But now resiliency is another thing that, although is bandied about, what does that mean to you in the context of advancing the supply chain, right? Because how do you feel about that? Or is there another word, or is there something else that's out there to kind of encompass that area?
If we're going to talk to non-supply chain people, resiliency means that time you went to the store anytime in the last 12 months and the thing was out of stock, it wouldn't have been.
Right.
But I would actually argue with you, Brian, on your Einstein comment earlier. A lot of people are sort of shocked that there's not a little workshop of elves in Target in the back.
They're surprised.
This wasn't made here.
It doesn't
And then the idea that our iPhones go around the moon and back. If you're in the US, each of your ingredients travel about 2,000 miles to get to you. Like your mint did not come from the backyard of your neighbor down the street. Shocking. Right. And so we have these very, very long supply chains, and long supply chains lead to disruption opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so for me, of course, I put disruption and risk and resiliency, the topic, the theme, together as a symptom of our long linear supply chains. And running the risk of saying circularity will solve all of our problems, it won't. Some of them. If we make shorter supply chains, then we have less opportunity. We're opening ourselves up less to risk. I think we will actually nail this local regional supply chain situation and still manage global supply chains. I think the steps we need to take to get to resilient, regional, circular supply networky bits, whatever we're going to call them, is not possible without the technology that's coming along with Industry 4.0. And we could have lived in a different way in these last 100 years, but I still argue the amount of economic growth that we've enabled for how many millions, billions of people may not have happened if we did it another way. So that kind of unlocks the door to some technology and where we're going in the future, which is also pretty rad. And as people think about what they really want as a consumer, one of my most satisfying moments walking through a city is thinking like, I could really go for a coffee. And then picking the perfect Starbucks and clicking order at the perfect time. So you walk in the door and pick it up and leave again is incredibly satisfying as a supply chain professional. These are the types of examples, if we can use them for normal people, to have them connect to the process in a supply chain. And it's not necessarily dumbing it down. It's taking something super complex and saying it in a way that anybody's going to care about, which today is often around the planet. So it gives us an opening to say, wouldn't it be great if that vegan leather was actually made down the street and not just another sweatshop halfway around the world?
Right. No, it's a good point. Brian, how about you? Daniel, jump in.
No, I don't want to. I just want to point out, Deborah just implied that supply chain professionals are not normal people. And with that Brian.
That is correct. I will own it. I think we're a proud folk, and I would not call us normal.
Well, that's... Anyone who's listening into this will figure that out real quick in the first couple minutes. Brian.
I agree with the observation that, and I think Deborah emphasized this, that the argument is not that modern supply chains as we know them are completely broken, completely bad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's none of that. And Daniel sort of took a jab at me and accused me of cheating, but which is true. But the way I think about someone who like me says we want to invest in innovations, that refashion global supply chains is. There are a lot of things that work great. And the idea is not to go and reinvent the wheel when the wheel does not need to be reinvented. And so our job is to figure out what isn't working right and who are the innovators, the technologists, the engineers who are working on solutions that have a really good chance of fixing those problems, and then supporting them with capital, with expertise, connecting them to supply chain professionals who can augment their knowledge and expertise with knowledge of the industries that they intend to have an impact in, and doing all those things that get them from a concept that's in an academic lab or in a garage someplace to something that's actually out in the world and solving problems for people. There's a documentary series on the BBC called Follow the Food.
Okay.
And on a series that they showed, I think it was yesterday or the day before, the presenter said something that completely blew my mind. But I think he said, in the next 30 years, the world is going to have to produce more food to field the world's population than we have produced in the entirety of human history.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's mind blowing when you think about it. Like,
mm-hmm.
The challenges that poses, but then the opportunities for, like I said, innovators and people in agriculture, people in technology, people in software engineering, people whose specialty is data and analytics and decision making. The opportunity for all these people to come together
mm-hmm.
and deal with the problems that we're going to be confronted with. That's what gets me excited. And Daniel, that's why I feel I have to cheat.
Well, before Daniel jumps in though, because I want to put a number behind Brian's statement, because this is the one that I always because when you talk about that, and again, this goes back to sort of transparency, education, but so what are we, 7.4, 7.5 billion, whatever the number is, roughly, give or take. But what most people don't realize is we're adding about 155 million births per year, and we've got on average about 55 million deaths per year. So we're adding net to the register about 100 million new souls on this planet on an annual basis. 100 million. That's 1/3 of the U.S. population every year adding to the register and going up, by the way, right? So it's, you start putting that in front of people and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't think of that. But to your point, of course, all of a sudden you're at 14 billion people, in 20 or 30 years, you've got huge supply chain. Our supply chain functions now, but imagine a pandemic that hits a world that's 2 or 3 times larger. I mean, it's, in the way that we reacted over this last year, that's frightening.
Yeah.
Well, in 30 years from now, 80% of that population will live in cities.
Right.
And if we start imagining the food production of the future, it won't be in fields. It's going to be underground, vertical, and we'll be growing it underneath the buildings where people are living. Mm-hmm. And that is happening already. The innovation happening in this space is pretty tremendous. What I'm continuously shocked about is the lack of supply chain professionals invited to the party. When all we do in life is identify systems constraints and the system. That's all
exactly.
we do. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I'm gonna jump in there. Actually, it's a perfect segue, because I'm gonna go back just a little bit, because Brian was talking about the role that Refashion is playing in providing capital and mentoring to innovators and startups. I will tell you, in my personal experience, one of the things that really is the key to making to helping startups be successful is making the connections to the people in the supply chain who do that work, which Deborah is exactly what you're talking about, right? There's somebody else off there doing something, but it's not going to go anywhere until you can connect it to the supply chain folks, right? Who are busy. They've already got jobs. And so how do you break through those filters and say, no, this is one that you really need to set aside half an hour and look at and think about. And I think that may be one of the real values of International Supply Chain Day, right? It is to get part of what we do on that day is say, we're busy, keeping the trains running on time, but let's pause and think a little bit for one day about innovation.
Right.
But how are supply chains changing? How does my supply chain need to change? Can we connect with other people? Can we use that day as the opportunity to get people making some of these connections, and then go off and do whatever you're going to do for the other 355 days? But at least for that one day. Right? Yeah. Take time to meet some people and open the eyes and the ears.
Right. And that's exactly the motivation that led us to forming the meetup, the supply chain meetup in New York, and the supply chain federation, the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation. Is that on the one hand, when we were talking to the technologists, we realized they get the technology, they're lacking the supply chain perspective. And then when we talk to the supply chain professionals and executives, they knew the supply chain perspective, but they didn't necessarily have a complete grasp on how far the technology has come. And I think it's exactly right. For Supply Chain Day, for International Supply Chain Day to succeed, it has to serve as a bridge between communities that are not necessarily talking to one another as much as they need to.
Right. And I'll throw out a little teaser here. Doubt it'll ever get picked up, but you never know. You got to say it. So as we talk about the future, 20, 30, 40 years out, and we're talking about the global supply chain, we're talking about 100 million people being added to the planet. It's also going to happen concurrent to that is we're going to have a solar system-based supply chain. And I would contend that if I look at SpaceX, and I'll be radical here, and I'll tell Elon Musk, that's actually not a rocket company, but it's actually a supply chain company. Yeah. You are building the first interstellar supply chain company. And that's exactly what, now, whether he likes to hear that or not, but he was always controversial, right?
Who's their competition?
Well, right now it wasn't, but you're seeing China come up. You're seeing Russia come up. I mean, they don't have any competition.
US-based competition.
Amazon. Well, that's what, Amazon, right, of course. But
that's always been the case. Right. I think probably all four of us have seen Amazon as a supply chain company
for sure,
for a long time, even though they didn't admit that themselves. And so if you spaceships into the mix, that's a light lift for them.
Go ahead, Deborah.
Isn't this a job for the Supply Chain Federation?
Yes, well, you've got the symbol already. It's the
the Star Trek was a federation,
Federation, yeah, Supply Chain Federation.
Then does that give us a chance for a noun?
Yes,
I got a kid screaming at me. I'll be right back.
Okay. Yeah, but I to that point though, and I think Brian, you're absolutely right. Supply Chain Federation. But I think Brian, you were picking up on that. Is this is also where I think this type of day allows people to also expand their view, right? Mm-hmm. And because most people would think, like you're saying, Deborah, supply chain, like, it's like, no, it's this whole world, it's everything. And if that's not exciting enough, well, let's get space involved for Christ's sake. Like how much more exciting do I need to give you? We'll go meet aliens and do supply chains with aliens, for God's sakes. Like that's where this thing is going.
Can I share something that happens? I coined a phrase for it, which I now can't remember. I think I called it something like the continuum of supply chain awareness or something of the sort. But it's this phenomenon I've noticed amongst my friends, and so this is very it's an anecdote that might not be based in any fact whatsoever. But what I've noticed is I am now excited about supply chain, and so that's all I talk about with my friends. Eventually, they get sick of hearing me talk about it and ignoring me, and so they pay attention to one article, and something catches their attention, and then they read another article and maybe a third. Suddenly, they're bombarding me with articles about that topic all the time. And then one day, like at 2 a.m., I get a text from them. Oh my God, this is such a big supply chain problem. Why doesn't anyone else care about it? I'm like, there are a lot of people who care about this.
Is that when you hand them your Brian's Friends Academy diploma? Congratulations.
That's when he hands him Daniel's book. He's like, here you go. Let's just start with Daniel's book, right? And then you get grounded.
You've graduated to actually learn.
Right. You're going to learn about it. So let me spin back around and also be conscious of time because if you put the four of us together, we'll spend the entire next week talking about this, and you'll throw us in the time capsule, and we'll still be talking about it. But now thinking about a day, so just an open question for you all is, I am unaware of anything that is an International Supply Chain Day, right? And, is there anything comparable? Because the other thing is we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? The point here is not to just do this just for giggles, right? We actually want to have practical. And one thing about supply chain people that I love in the community, they're practical. They like to get stuff done, right? Theoretical is interesting, but how does this affect me and what do I need to do? So question open-ended is there anything like this? How do we partner with anything? I don't think there is, but like the CSCMP, Daniel, you brought up. I mean, I reached out to them. There's a call out to them. We'd love to line up with you all, but there isn't a true day that everyone gets together and just earmarks, this is where we are and this is the progress we've made year over year.
So this is the cynicism that I was talking about at the beginning.
Yep.
There have been lots of efforts that I've seen to do it. And I would put them into probably three categories. Every supply chain association sort of throws out and says, hey, we're going to make it a day. And it kind of, they'll throw it out and maybe do it for a couple of years and it sputters out and it goes away. It's really just promotion for the organization.
Right.
I've seen companies do it. Well-meaning, right? And, they'll throw a little party and do same thing. It's like, well, why would anybody else jump on board because that company is doing it? Right? I mean, there's really no incentive. I've also seen universities do it, right? And there it's generally promoting the major or tied to either a hiring event or a recruiting event for students. And honestly, like, none of them ever get anywhere. They're all these sort of little pockets, which I think is your point. And so I think that's an indication that there's a desire, there's some demand in the market for that and some maybe support that could be leveraged. But the challenge is, how do you not repeat that? Right? How do you do it in a way that you're not, again, just a company or a brand or an association? And as I've reflected on it, Richard, because I mean, it is a question like why hasn't? And I think really the right place for it to start would be some kind of consortium of universities, right? If you could get a group, and Deborah's skeptical, which I like, but I think if you could somehow get a consortium of influential supply chain universities to agree that they were all going to do things to promote that department, that major, that field at the same time. Maybe you can't do it in a day because then they'd end up kind of competing, but maybe you could do a week, maybe you could do a month, maybe each of them could have their own day during the month, something. I think that they might be able to pull some companies along with them. And then maybe draw in the associations. But I just think, the universities, between the students, between the future students that they're trying to attract and their connections to alumni who are out working in industry, I think that's probably the highest leverage point in the ecosystem to actually drive collaboration as opposed to competition.
Deborah, you look like, I saw the thinking there. I'm just going to throw out there because as you were talking that through, and I know, it's sort of I haven't thought it through completely yet, but I think about Ben Bellamy over at the Disability Council, right? I mean, it's an interesting group because it's it's a pay for marketing, whatever you want to call it, or kind of research collaboration group. But something like that has a bunch of industry. It has a cross section of participants that they could throw their weight behind to kind of create something like this. Because to your point, Daniel, I've reached out to the UN. There's no playbook for this. There's no how do you get this going? So there is something. Because the thing that I think everyone on this call wants to see happen is, we'd love to see it move forward. We'd all participate. There's no question about that. The enthusiasm's here. All of us have day jobs, if not 2 or 3 day jobs, looking at this panel, like the way we all work. But how do you get something where it's a neutral, it doesn't feel like it's a corporate or government sponsored, but brings the community along. Because to your point, the community, I think, even wants it, right? So, it's like there's a desire, but
there has to be something in it for them.
Right.
Do you want to hear my idea on what's in it for them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So when I think about a supply chain day, and then we think about why would anybody tune into anything? Because probably there's going to be some virtual components, because part of the cool part of this is that let's go down Daniel's path and say it is a network of universities, and we make sure that there's actual representation from many, many countries around the world. Great. Part of the cool thing would be calling in and then getting to meet somebody from a different part of the world. And when we have events, we have 2, 3, 4 continents show up. And part of the magic is that we all speak the same nerdy language of supply chain, and we all know what each other means. So we can immediately start getting into problem solving. And so with this, I think we actually do mini problem solving, like a miniature supply chain hackathon type of an event. I think what the folks at Fresh Connection do, imagine that, but in a day, and everybody gets a problem statement at the other side. Then we have like Shark Tank like pitches. Innovators pitches, I think, could be quite cool. Ideation sessions, how-to sessions, because I think we want to balance super practical supply chain. This seems like it's going to be 5 years from now. Call me then. And so what do I do right now? And then let's talk about where the field is going and the impact we can have. And if we did that well, and again, it's like, who's we? Then people can have a space to come around and every year look forward to like the Olympics that's only for 4 years. What's every year? Some sports playoff event type thing that's just one day in a year, and everybody gets their hardest problems together, and everybody gets their really cool team together and comes and just kind of like nerds out. It's like the mathathon. What is that called? Right. There's like a math.
The math Olympiad or something like that.
Like that for supply chain. Because then if we get into Daniel's earlier point, or maybe Richard, you said this on getting to kids earlier in school, there should be a supply chain after school club, just like math club. And yes, I was the captain of my math club many years in a row in drama and orchestra. And is that surprising to anyone? No. However, it would be pretty cool to then have the elementary school, middle school, high school equivalents around the world to also participate and showcase what they've been working on, give out free curriculum leading up to that day, et cetera, and so forth. So that's what I think we should do, and actually come out with actual helpful ideas, next steps, problem solved, et cetera.
Right. There.
Richard, thanks for planning it. Let me know.
Right.
I just got to, Deborah, something you said there clicked. I love the idea of doing a Shark Tank because, Brian is in the perfect position to do pitch day kind of stuff, right? And to do Shark Tank kind of stuff. That should totally be part of it. And I think Richard, maybe
he's also got the federation too. He's already got the meetups and all the things kind of going there. So right. I'm already starting to punt this a little bit. Hey,
then I'm going to shut up now and let you
keep
going.
Idea. Go for it.
That's our show.
I didn't realize this was a trap. I didn't realize I was being led.
You just got suckered in, Brian. You had no idea.
We're actually not recording it at all. The whole thing was just.
But I too wanted to touch on something that Deborah said. I think Deborah, you made you mentioned this in passing, which is when some of these conversations are happening, it can seem like, oh, when is this going to occur? In 5 or 10 years? Call me then. And one thing I've noticed since I really decided to double down on supply chain and innovation is that the cycles are really short, at least based on the observations I've been making. So it wasn't too long ago, based on everything I had read, I started thinking, gosh, we're going to start seeing supply chain platforms. And the way they're going to look now is that someone with expertise in physical logistics is going to team up with someone with expertise in software. And then the next thing you know, it's, Google is teaming up with JB Hunt, and Microsoft is teaming up with Maersk, and Microsoft is teaming up with FedEx. Even going back to, 2017, I think, based on talking to a bunch of people about shipping and blockchain, I was like, it seems like some sort of blockchain network for shipping seems to be the theme I'm hearing. And then I think I wrote a blog post, and maybe 2 days later, I read about TradeLens. And then, just more recently, in December of 2019, I wrote an article for FreightWaves. And I think it was something like 3 observations for climate change and industrial supply chains. And the first point I made was citizen action. We're going to see more citizen action, et cetera, et cetera. And you could look at that and you'd be like, it's Brian again. It's going to be 5 or 10 years. Just yesterday or the day before yesterday, Shell, ExxonMobil, and Chevron were all in different forms of citizen action, right? So Shell got this court ruling that went against them in the Netherlands, and then ExxonMobil, I think for the first time in their history, had to deal with an activist investor successfully challenging their nominations for seats on the board. And so all this is beginning to happen at a much quicker pace. And I think companies that think, it's going to be 5 years, it's going to be 10 years before this has an impact on my corporation or on my job as an executive, I think might be making a very painful strategic miscalculation.
Yeah. Let me quickly just, we're going to wrap up because I was going to keep us to an hour, right? And I knew everyone was going to get on here. Any one of us we can occupy an hour without blinking. But the takeaway, I think, in all of this is there is enthusiasm, right? There's no question about it. How it takes shape, that's somewhat to be determined.
And skepticism.
Well, and of course, always. Yep, that's good. Healthy, gotta have it. Scientific method. Scientific method.
Always skepticism.
Right? Question everything. And there are some themes around, obviously, circularity, sustainability, transparency, visibility, and resiliency risk, right? Sort of as big buckets, right? And, but information, awareness, picking a day, just kind of doing it. And I'm not saying I've got the answers all right. None of us have the answers right now, but I think we could get behind something like this if it takes shape. So if people have ideas, we'll just share them. We're going to publish this. Maybe this takes shape. And I'm hoping the whole point of putting this together is someone listens in, is like, I can help, or I'm from this organization. We can do this. Like that's kind of the point of just kind of getting this going. So I want to thank everybody for participating today. It was really awesome. Great conversation as always. Everyone go forth and have a wonderful day. Everyone will have Supply Chain Dummies book in the background next time, right?
Buy the book. Buy the book.
Exactly. Awesome.
Richard, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Brian,
Deborah,
Thanks for pulling us together.
This is Richard Donaldson. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about the episode or topics in supply chain you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, why not check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud, collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at www.requis.com.